Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we step into the after-midnight streets of New York, where neon glows on quiet sidewalks and power moves through hushed conversations instead of raised voices. This is the world of Thomas Eboli, a man guided by composure, not impulse, where respect was earned through balance, patience, and the ability to keep peace in a world always on edge. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of sudden danger, but because it demanded constant self-control and the wisdom to speak only when necessary. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's shadowed corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city hum soften, and settle in as we ease into the calm, calculating story of Thomas Eboli. The night Thomas first understood the difference between noise and meaning, he was 8 years old and the city sounded like a machine with too many gears. Horns, laughter, a radio on a windowsill, someone arguing, the slow whoosh of a truck. He pressed his face to the cold glass of his family's tiny apartment and watched steam curl from manhole covers like small ghosts, while everyone else in the building seemed to be making the most of the evening. Voices rising and falling, neighbors swapping stories through cracked doors. Thomas listened. He let the city speak without answering back. The lesson arrived not as a lesson but as a pattern. Some sounds were warnings, others invitations, and most were simply noise. He learned to separate them without fuss. That small discipline would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his life. Growing up was quieter than any movie about the era. There were no grand scenes of instant transformation, no cinematic betrayals. His family kept their heads down. They worked shifts and saved what they could. Thomas learned to read the economy of small things, the way a barber remembered credit, how a grocer slid a coupon into a pocket for a regular, how fellow workers exchanged favors without announcing them. He developed a kind of practical empathy, noticing who needed a hand before they asked for it, offering it without spectacle. That was the currency of his neighborhood, and he learned to be wealthy in it. School taught him facts and schedules and how to perform when people watched. The street taught him subtler things: posture, timing, the economy of silence. He paid attention to how grown men sat in meetings, how they framed a sentence to make a threat without shouting, how a small apology could smooth the roughest exchange. It was not a moral education exactly. It was a manual of survival. Thomas absorbed it not because he liked the world that produced those lessons, but because he wanted to be useful in it. Utility, he thought, could be a form of dignity. When he was older, he worked at odd jobs that layered his knowledge like sediment. He understood logistics in a way few people did, schedules, who preferred early shifts which routes clogged on certain days. He learned to appreciate the patience it took to keep something ordinary running. There was beauty in ordinariness, in a delivery that arrived on time and a shop that opened its doors because someone had done a small, steady thing the night before. Thomas admired that quiet architecture, and it shaped the way he moved through life. There were temptations to another kind of life, the one that flashed and dazzled. Men who thrived on spectacle made their way through the neighborhood sometimes, and they offered bright and easy promises. Faster money, bigger respect, a brand of life that required less waiting and more showing. Thomas watched them. He watched how the shine wore off within months for some and years for others, watched the way a misstep that had to be paid off privately bloomed into a public problem when neglected. He kept his distance not out of moral superiority but out of calculation. Quick gains came with hidden costs. That fact stayed true across any situation he observed. Over time, opportunity curdled into direction. Thomas found himself in positions where discretion mattered. People trusted him with small things, holds on accounts, quiet deliveries, messages that required discretion. He developed a reputation as someone who could be counted on not to make the wrong kind of noise. That reputation did not arrive with fanfare. It grew like a tree grows, slowly out of sight, until one day the shade it provided was obvious and people sat beneath it without thinking who had planted the seed. He was not a man prone to speeches. He preferred questions and timing. Ask the right question at the right moment and men revealed their shape. Let them talk themselves through an idea and a better path often emerged. without anyone losing face. He found, in these quiet negotiations, a kind of artistry. He framed a question like an opening chord and let the rest of the room harmonize. People left by their own admission feeling like it was their idea. Thomas considered that a success. Getting the result while preserving dignity felt to him like a truer power than any title. Life, as it does, offered both simple joys and complex obligations. He fell in love with small things. An early morning cup of coffee that tasted like nothing special but was perfect in the right moment. The neat way an envelope of bills could fit into a single drawer and make the world behave for a week. The laugh of a child who thought the man wearing that neutral expression was secretly the funniest person in the room. He married with no spectacle. It was an arrangement rooted in mutual steadiness rather than fireworks. They built their household as they had built their lives. Deliberately, with modesty. The rhythm of it, shared meals, shared small responsibilities, anchored him. As the years advanced, Thomas's responsibilities widened. He became someone others leaned toward when a problem had to be made small again. If a supplier needed a delay, he found ways to make it courteous. If a worker needed a bridge loan, he arranged something quiet and easily repayable. These were not heroic acts, and he never expected them to be. They were functional, repairs to the human machinery that kept everyday life humming. He took satisfaction in that, in the thought that more mornings would open calmly because of an unremarked decision made the night before. The world around him hardened and softened in cycles. There were seasons of prosperity where everyone took fewer small risks and seasons of scarcity that forced difficult choices. Thomas's instincts favored the long game. He liked to think of himself as an insurance policy of a kind, not a safety net in one dramatic swoop, but a steady seam of support that reduced the probability of catastrophe. That view shaped how he judged options. It made him conservative in action but not in vision. He could see futures others could not precisely because he extended the timeline in his head and watched how small actions accumulated. There were moments of moral friction. Sometimes the best practical solution was not the purest ethical one. He kept a ledger in his mind of trade-offs, measuring who might be hurt and whether the hurt could be repaired. He refused some paths that would have made life easier for him because the cost in other people's lives seemed too high. But he was pragmatic enough to accept compromises when the alternative would have brought more harm. His ethics were not tidy. They were iterative. He learned to apologize when a choice had netted more harm than good, to repair when possible, and to carry the memory forward like a cautionary map. As he grew into influence, he understood how narratives took shape. People preferred stories with heroes and villains. They loved the idea of a single defining moment. He thought that a strange preference for a world so usually composed of many small negotiations. Therefore, he avoided singular moments. He avoided standing on stages. He preferred to be the surplus calm in a room, the invisible hinge that allowed doors to open and close smoothly. To him, a life of small, intact mornings was more meaningful than a life of grand gestures that attracted attention and then dissolved under scrutiny. There was a steady presence in his life, a man for whom he did small, crucial favors, a call placed at just the right time, a problem averted with a single note, a temper cooled by a well-timed silence. That man's trust was an anchor, and in return Thomas's proximity to him sharpened certain responsibilities. He saw inside rooms where plans were made and where the arithmetic of decisions had human faces. The trust allowed him to act in ways he could not otherwise, but it also complicated the moral ledger. The closer he stood to power, the more often decisions had downstream consequences beyond the immediate circle. Thomas learned to slow his own desire for convenience in recognition of that reality. Meanwhile, the city's character changed. New energies arrived. Young men with quick plans, new technologies that promised speed, new markets that reshuffled old certainties. The old rhythms he had relied on showed hairline cracks. People who once took time to think now rushed into trials. Conversation was sometimes replaced by instant messages and the false urgency they created. Thomas watched these currents with curiosity and caution. He understood that adaptation was necessary. A system that could not change would ossify. But he also noted that speed without judgment made brittle systems. His work, then, became not only to keep things steady but to manage transitions, to let innovation arrive without throwing away the scaffolding that kept ordinary lives whole. Conflict, when it came, arrived not in an explosion but in the shifting of expectations. Younger men pressed for bolder plans and had less patience for the slow accrual of trust. They judged restraint as timidity. Thomas listened, argued when necessary, and sometimes allowed experiments on a small scale so the risk could be measured. He preferred pilots and modest trials to wholesale change. Where others wanted to win fast, he wanted to win in a way that could be sustained without sacrificing the people who depended on the machinery running well. There were costs to his approach. He was sometimes labeled as an obstacle, an old-fashioned man standing in the way of progress. That accusation stung only because he believed the accusation misread his aim. He did not resist change for nostalgia's sake. He resisted it when the scale of changes threatened to topple ordinary lives for the sake of rare, speculative gain. He accepted frustration as part of stewardship. He answered it with more patience, not less. In quieter hours, he reflected on the odd intimacy of his position. He had access to confidences yet remained, in many ways, a private person. He loved small domestic rituals, a shared cup of coffee in the morning, a notebook where he put down trivial observations, walks that helped him translate turmoil into a map of steps. These rituals preserved a self that the job could otherwise erode. They reminded him that the work had a human end. People waking in the morning who would not find their worlds rearranged without notice. At times, he would think about legacy not as how his name might appear in a list or a headline, but as the habits he left behind. Would people learn to value patience? Would they carry forward an ethic of repair rather than spectacle? He hoped that the structures he defended would outlast him because they were woven into daily practice rather than being anchored to personalities. In that hope, he took comfort. There were evenings when the city felt merciful. The light over the river spread like a velvety lapsing tide, and Thomas would stand at the window and think of the small acts that made the next day possible. A manifest checked, a promise kept, a debt paid on time. These were not dramatic things, but they meant the world to someone. He liked the thought that his work, anonymous and unsung, created a kind of civic mercy, a chance for ordinary dignity. He carried that conviction forward like a warm coat in winter, and yet he knew a test would come. The young energies pushing for change would not abate simply because he counseled caution. The world moves whether one is ready for it or not. He felt the pressure building like a tone beneath a melody, an undercurrent that suggested an approaching swell. He prepared not by posturing, but by reinforcing small systems. Written agreements where promises had previously sufficed, clearer channels of communication, contingency plans that had been ceremonial becoming real. He taught those around him to value margin, the small buffers that let a system absorb shock without breaking. So he waited in the way he always had, alert, patient, ready. He continued to do the small things that mattered. He kept the ledger in his mind tidy. He asked questions that reframed fights as logistics, and he let others find their courage through doing real, reparable work. He did not romanticize endurance. He accepted its costs and calculated them, and when the moment to act came, he intended to do so with the same unshowy, considered resolve that had carried him this far. In the dark hours, when the city seemed to breathe quietly and the lights inside buildings winked like thought bubbles across a map, Thomas would sometimes imagine the future as a long corridor of doors, each one opening to a possible morning. He worked to make sure that the doors were not jammed, that hinges were oiled, that steps were clear. Not for glory, not for applause, but because he believed some mornings deserved the dignity of starting on time. The first part of his story ends on a particular kind of promise. A promise not of spectacle, but of steadiness. The coming chapters, the tests, the choices, the small and large sacrifices, would not declare themselves in headlines. They would arrive in meetings, in gestures, in the late phone calls that make or unmake someone's week. Thomas Eboli had built his life on the belief that steadiness, applied patiently, can shape more mornings than any flash of brilliance. He did not know yet how this belief would be tested. He only knew that when the tide rose, he would be there to measure its force and to decide, carefully, which steps kept people whole. The seasons slipped by in patterns that always surprised him with their predictability. A slow warming, a furious summer that tired even the loudest streets, an autumn that smelled of leaves and coal smoke, a winter that pressed its hand against the windows until people stayed in, and talked less and thought more. Thomas tracked those ordinary cycles like other men tracked stock tickers. They were a measure of continuity, a proof that the small systems he cared for still functioned. If the seasons continued, the world retained its rules. Rules he could learn to live within, and sometimes bend just a little, always with care. In the months after he began shouldering more responsibilities, his days settled into routines he had chosen deliberately. He woke early, before the windows glowed, and walked the block to a coffee shop that kept 2 stools warmed for him. The owner, a man with a soft voice and a fondness for small talk, left his morning papers folded on the counter. Thomas read the headlines for the trivia, but he paid attention to the local notes. Which businesses were slowing orders, which suppliers were late. Small anomalies were where the future often showed its elbows. If you noticed them, you had a chance to adjust before others even read the sign. His work, as it had grown, became less about direct action and more about orchestration. He learned to listen to reports and then to sit them down with perspective. This delay is not a crisis if we can reroute 3 shipments. That new player in the market is a risk if they underpay their workers. Yes, trial the new system but make it reversible. He taught apprentices how to ask the right questions, simple ones that forced a decision maker to lay out consequences. Who pays if a run is late? Was the kind of question that cut through the romance of an idea and revealed its structure. He liked to think in margins and contingencies. The true test of any plan, he would say, was whether it left enough room for ordinary lives to continue. There was a rhythm to the small human errors that otherwise went unnoticed. A clerk miscounts on a Friday and the error compounds over a weekend, becoming a headache by Monday morning. A driver takes a shortcut and learns it costs more in wear than it saves. In time, Thomas watched these rhythms and taught others where to place buffers, an extra pallet here, a small emergency fund there. These were not dramatic rescues. They were prudential acts that kept people from spending nights worrying about rent. He took satisfaction in seeing a morning open without a scramble because someone had done a small, unglamorous thing the night before. People came to him for different reasons. Some wanted advice, others wanted permission. He tried to make a distinction between the two and give what was needed. Advice could be broad, how to keep books that didn't hide the truth. Permission was narrow, a temporary credit extension so a small owner could survive a delay. Thomas learned to grant permission with conditions that protected the community. He didn't hand out favors as if they were badges. He arranged them as deliberate measures to preserve stability. The ledger in his mind tracked these choices as carefully as his own checkbook. They mattered because life mattered, and the arithmetic of dignity was a thing he took seriously. His circle was small but deep. There were men and women who had seen him at his best and at his worst. They trusted him not because he was genial or charming, but because he kept the promises he made, even if they were simple. Call back, arrive on time, honor the agreement on paper. Promises were cheap when only words were exchanged. They carried weight when they were tracked, recorded, and, if necessary, enforced gently. He taught people the discipline of honoring obligations not as a moral panacea but as a practical method for keeping life predictable. There were dinners and small family rituals that steadied him. His spouse, steady, unflappable, with a laugh that could smooth the night, kept a small apartment that smelled of boiled coffee and bread. They didn't have grand dinners, but they had a table where arguments were resolved and lists were made. Their partnership was not theatrical. It was lived in. The day's details, the way they split errand lists, the way each knew the other's exhaustion threshold. Those private economies of care were, to Thomas, just as important as the public ones he managed. He found in them a softness he rarely showed the world. The quieter parts of the job gave him space to study people. He learned how pride shaped decisions. Men said no in meetings because they needed respect more than they needed truth. Women made concessions quietly to keep daily life manageable while waiting for larger shifts in power. Thomas watched these dynamics and tried to create a climate where people could take responsibility without feeling publicly diminished. He thought power worked best when it allowed people to save face and still do the hard work required. He measured success not in moments of domination, but in the number of mornings that opened calmly. As his responsibilities continued, he made deliberate choices about technology and modernization. New systems promise speed and new efficiency, but they also promise brittleness. An algorithm that optimized a route could fail in a storm. A digital ledger could be as inscrutable as a hidden deal if the people who used it did not understand it. He insisted on human checks, on training that would make automation useful without becoming an excuse to ignore judgment. Progress, to Thomas, was not about replacing people with machines, but about augmenting human capacity with better tools. Tools that respected the limits and the dignity of the workers who used them. There were nights, though, when the difference between caution and paralysis felt thinner than desirable. He had to guard against becoming a brake that stopped necessary change under the banner of prudence. He cultivated apprentices and encouraged experimentation in limited, contained ways. He urged small pilots, measures with rollback options, so innovation could be learned without catastrophic side effects. It was a way to keep the system from ossifying. The younger men who pushed for acceleration were easier to mentor in some ways than in others. They had energy, ideas, and impatience that could spark beneficial changes when properly focused. But they also had blind spots. One of them might see a gap in distribution and suggest a leap that ignored the workers who did the night runs. Thomas tried to translate their bravado into manageable steps. Run a test route for a month, analyze disruptions, report back, then scale. Sometimes they accepted the restraint. Other times their impatience led them to circumvent the safeguards. Those instances taught him about the need for clearer accountability and the importance of trust structures that could survive rashness. Outside his immediate sphere, broader currents reshaped the terrain. Political changes in the city government brought new regulations. Shifting economic patterns altered the flow of goods. Neighborhoods gentrified and shifted the kinds of businesses that needed service. Thomas noticed these slow tides and recalibrated. When franchises replaced local shops, when chain stores demanded different schedules, he adapted slowly, negotiating terms and trying to make sure that the old networks of trust weren't simply discarded. It was a long, patient work. Convert, adapt, preserve what still mattered. He had to make hard ethical choices too. Sometimes, to keep a larger number of people safe, he had to call on people whose methods he did not admire. He accepted this as part of stewardship. He preferred to make alliances that emphasized repair and restitution, not extraction. When someone crossed a line too many times, when their behavior risked the safety of others, he withdrew support and sought alternatives. That withdrawal often hurt people temporarily, but it was designed to protect the larger whole. He paid attention to the moral cost and attempted to mitigate it. Apologies, when sincere, were followed by concrete acts of repair. Shaky promises were never good enough. Even with the stress, he found small pleasures. He liked a neat list, the satisfaction of checked items at day's end. He kept notebooks with scraps of detail, names, slight habits, the preferred hour of a particular supplier's call. Those scraps became a map. He would look back at an old entry and see how it informed a decision months later. The map was both practical and almost sacred in his mind, a record of connection and obligation. There were times when friends asked if he ever regretted the cautious path. They envied men who had leapt and won in the short term. He admitted to small envies sometimes, but he always returned to the larger truth he felt. That steadiness had the potential to protect more lives than daring brilliance. The people who built lives quietly were the ones who sustained neighborhoods. He liked to imagine a morning where a seamstress finished her job and placed it on a rack. Unpaid bills balanced, a child fed. Those mornings were his measure of success. As the months turned, he began to sense tectonic shifts among those ambitious younger men. The energy in the meetings had changed. It was less experimental and more urgent. They were no longer merely proposing improvements. Some wanted to change the rules themselves. They spoke of consolidation and of seizing opportunities that required force as much as negotiation. Thomas watched these proposals with a growing unease. Force often solved a problem in the short term but fractured the ties that made daily life survivable. He began to press for clearer analysis without grandstanding, with an eye toward the human cost. He increased his attention to transition planning. If change was inevitable, it should be managed for continuity. He pushed for phased implementations, for safety nets, for training budgets. He insisted that any move toward consolidation include protections for the smallest operators, those who did not have the luxury of absorbing disruptions. He argued for buyout terms that included assistance for displaced workers. These were not the headlines anyone wanted, but they were the measures people needed. Slowly, some listened. Others brushed the ideas aside as obstacles to growth. The tension ratcheted slowly but surely. The younger men grew more convinced of their strategy. Some older allies lost patience. He navigated the shifting alliances the way a steersman navigates currents, by making small corrections rather than abrupt turns. He would not gamble the lives of many for the ambitions of a few. He began to hold private conversations with those whose decisions mattered, not to lecture but to share his view of the downstream effects. Sometimes he found receptive ears. Other times he did not. Those were the nights he felt the old loneliness return, a reminder that stewardship could be a solitary work. Amid all this, his private life remained a harbor. Evenings with his partner, the small rituals of home, the quiet pride in a child's accomplishment, the human things that made the policy choices feel less abstract. Those moments kept him human in a job that, by design, could hollow a person out. They reminded him of why he resisted rashness. Because every bold move was someone else's risk. He felt responsible not because he sought glory, but because he had seen how quickly people's lives could unravel when decisions were made without care. The year closed with a winter that felt severe even by that city's standards. Storms tested routes, deliveries were delayed, and the people who relied on punctuality felt the strain. His contingency plans were put to the test. He stayed awake longer, coordinating small shifts, making sure someone who needed a delivery could get it with an extra mile of effort. Those nights were the ones that proved his methods. The fragile system bent but did not break. In the morning, the gratitude was small and quiet. An extra cup of coffee sent to a tired mechanic, a note tucked into a ledger, but for Thomas, these were proofs enough that the work mattered. And as the lights in his neighborhood blinked on against the dark, he allowed himself a modest satisfaction. He had kept a room from catching fire. He had not reinvented the world, but he had kept it livable. That, to him, was a quiet kind of victory. The young men continued to push. The older men spoke less. Thomas kept preparing. He reinforced buffers and trained people to think a few steps further ahead. He encouraged the apprentices to value repair as much as expansion. The moral map he kept in his head grew more detailed, and the lines of responsibility tightened. What would happen next, he couldn't say for sure. The future, to him, remained a corridor of doors. He kept his hand on the handle of more than one, testing hinges, making sure none would jam catastrophically. He did not believe that he could make the right choice for everyone, but he believed he could weigh costs with enough care to avoid grotesque outcomes. That belief sustained him. In the slow quiet of his apartment that winter night, he made notes for the coming season. A list of apprentices he would trust with more responsibility, contingency steps he wanted formalized, and a plan to meet with the young men to see if practical demonstration could build understanding. He was not naive about their impatience, but he still hoped that showing the cost of haste, in real numbers and real examples, might temper their zeal. He intended not to preach but to demonstrate. He banked his small satisfactions and braced for the next phase. The city outside was a tangle of light and motion, but inside his room, where the paper notes glowed under a lamp, there was the smell of coal smoke, the soft creak of the radiator, and the sense that he was, for the time being, keeping the world's mornings intact. He slept with that uneventful pride, knowing everything could unravel soon, but also knowing that he had built, brick by careful brick, a way for people to live without constant fear. When dawn came, he rose and walked out the door. The world was waiting, and so were the small tasks that made it continue. He walked with the same deliberate gait he had always used, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his notebook tucked inside his jacket. The day would ask things of him. He would answer, as he always did, with small, steady acts that rarely made stories but made mornings possible. The week that followed felt like a slow turning of gears. Nothing exploded. There were no sudden betrayals, no dramatic arrests, no cinematic confrontations. The world he inhabited rarely delivered spectacle. It delivered accumulations. Small choices piled one atop another until a slope either leveled or became a cliff. Thomas watched those piles form the way some men watch the weather, by noticing tiny changes and knowing what they could mean when repeated. One morning, a young operator came through the office with a bright idea that smelled strongly of ambition. He was all energy. Quick hands, quicker smile, a voice that assumed the future could be shifted by will alone. He proposed consolidating several small distribution points into a single hub, promising savings and cleaner accounting. In the rush of his pitch, there was the attractive geometry of efficiency. Fewer trucks idle, fewer overlaps, routes that could be tightened like a drum. On paper, it glittered. Thomas listened the way he always had, mostly in silence, with questions shaped to reveal the underside. "Who loses if this happens?" he asked. The room stilled as if someone had turned the volume down. The young man blinked, surprised. He had rehearsed numbers but not consequences. He had not spoken to the small owners whose lives depended on the very slowness he proposed to cut. A few heads in the room shifted. The ledger of human cost was not in the spreadsheet he'd brought. "You'll find a way to make them whole," someone offered, because hope is persuasive. "Buyouts? Contracts? Lump sums?" Thomas shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Lump sums buy time. Time buys trouble if the new model fails in one winter storm or a cash crunch. Where will those people go when a hub closes and the new system misfires?" He did not mean to scold. He wanted them to think. The young man left with his energy partly damped but not defeated. A few others whispered in corners, fascinated but nervous. The idea would not die. New money always has a way of pressing itself into old places. Thomas made notes quietly, not to veto, but to build contingencies. The next day, the city handed him a small practical test. A supplier on the west side had a delayed contract. A whole chain of small shops would be affected by the shortage if it was not filled. Panic could spread fast. Panic is a contagion that mutates plans into mistakes. Thomas called people. He called one person who owed him nothing but would move when asked because he respected one thing: steadiness. An extra pallet here, a temporary credit there, a driver rerouted for an afternoon, small interventions, each with a modest cost and a large benefit. By morning, the shops had flour on their shelves again, and the baker who had been close to canceling an order wrote a note of thanks on a scrap of plain paper and tucked it under the coffee machine in Thomas's usual diner. He kept that scrap in his wallet for weeks. It weighed less than a coin but felt like proof. His method was therefore visible to others. Patch, reroute, protect. It was not glamorous. It did not advertise itself, but it kept mornings intact. More and more people began to notice that when unexpected things happened, Thomas's responses were reliable and gentle. That reliability made him valuable in a way tabloids could never capture. He let people plan without fear. Yet being indispensable carries a private cost. The more people relied on him, the more their risks folded into his ledger. He began to feel those accumulated, responsibilities like a pressure behind his ribs. He found himself awake at odd hours, imagining the thin places where a bad decision could tear the fabric. In the small hours he would rise, make black coffee, and read the lines of his notebook by lamplight. Names, dates, small favors that had become obligations. He was honest with himself. Obligations are not burdens if they are chosen, but they still shape your life. He continued to teach by example. A young apprentice came through one rainy afternoon, the kind of man who expected magic and wanted it quickly. Thomas took him on a run. Not the glamorous route, the night run that required patience and small diplomacy. He showed him how to speak on the phone to a foreman who had been stiffed before, how to listen for exhaustion in a driver's voice, how to offer a face-saving delay rather than a blunt ultimatum. The apprentice watched, took notes, then tried it the next night and called Thomas the following morning with a voice that sounded slightly chastened and oddly proud. "It works," he said. People reply when you make them feel counted. That's the point, Thomas said. No one wants to be a ledger line. They want to be a life. Pressure came not only from the hungry, but from the unexpected. An audit from a city office arrived with an official tone and questions that could, if mishandled, shift gossip into suspicion. He prepared the records, of course, neat manifests, receipts where needed, documented conversations where oral agreements once sufficed. He invited the inspector for a run, let him see the mechanics of the day, how a warehouse organized kits for the elderly and how drivers learned shortcuts that respected traffic and safety. The inspector left with fewer questions than he had started with, and Thomas felt the relief that follows when transparency quiets rumor. There were small human rewards. A driver came by one morning with a photograph of his child's school play. The driver's pride lit his. Feeling, an arranged payment plan, a brief loan from a mutual friend, and a mediation that saved jobs and reputation. Even after the immediate crisis resolved, the repair shop owner would hug him once with gratitude and never again speak his debts aloud. Those quiet acknowledgments were what he carried home at night. As the weeks folded into each other, Thomas grew more deliberate in another way. He began to write small manuals. They were not recipes for grand strategy, but practical checklists. Who to call when a driver was sick, how to route around festival traffic in September, which clerks preferred morning notices and which responded better to texts afternoon. He compiled these into a binder that he kept in his desk and, once a month, gave a copy to a trusted apprentice. He had no illusion that a book could replace judgment. It could not, but a binder could spare people from repeating obvious errors. Small habits, he believed, add up, and always in the back of his mind was the push for consolidation. It never went away. Men with appetites for scale continued to press the idea at meetings, pitching refined versions that seemed more considerate but still carried hidden costs. Thomas began to ask a different kind of question in those gatherings. If this is better, how do we test it without leaving someone without a morning? He pushed for pilots that included failure modes, real plans for what would happen if a hub was overwhelmed, money for temporary relief if small operators were displaced, job retraining where consolidation could not avoid layoffs. These were not the lines of the heroic. They were the lines of insurance. Some of the young men listened and adapted. Others grumbled and sought faster paths. The room of ideas was unpredictable now, sometimes fertile, sometimes sharp with impatience. Thomas felt the tension as a physical thing, an ache behind the sternum, a slight inability to sleep through certain nights. But he also felt something else. Growing cadre of people who had learned to ask better questions. The apprentices he'd mentored began to show an instinct for repair that made him feel slightly less solitary. The part of him that loved small victories felt nourished when a mechanic, whose shop he'd helped keep afloat, sent him a box of small, gleaming wrenches. For the nights, the mechanic wrote on a scrap. Thomas laughed and placed the box in a drawer. Those wrenches were useful. They were also a kind of thanks that didn't want to be sung about. At the heart of all the days, he kept returning to the same conviction. Systems survive when people are treated as people, not as units of profit. He believed that with the clarity of someone who had watched the other side, the one that prioritized speed over people, and lived through the collapses that followed. He did not romanticize his patience as moral superiority. He saw it as a practical commitment. If you hold 1,000 small lives intact, you shelter the possibility of greater good. So Thomas continued to do what he had always done. Listen more than he spoke, prepare more than he promised, and teach more than he commanded. The next challenge was already leaning in his direction, subtle and patient. It would ask more of him than a neat schedule or a polite mediation. It would ask for decisions that would shape not only jobs and routes, but the habits and dignity of the people whose mornings depended on them. He felt the moment approaching the way sailors feel a fog bank on the horizon. Slow, sure, demanding attention. And when it came, he planned to meet it the way he had met everything else, with small, careful acts and the steadiness of a man who had learned that the most important work is rarely loud. The days that followed felt like a slow tightening of a rope. The consolidation talk hadn't gone away. If anything, it found new voices and better arguments. Men who had once mouthed the logic of efficiency now came with graphs, and soft-spoken consultants, their power shrouded in spreadsheets instead of swagger. The plan changed shape as people refined it. Smaller hubs, phased closures, promises of buyouts and retraining. Each version sounded kinder than the last. Each version still asked someone to give up the rhythms that held their mornings together. Thomas watched the plan's shinier iterations the way a careful mechanic watches a new part on an old engine. It might fit and it might run smoother, but would the tolerances be right? Would the sudden heat of one changed joint warp parts that depended on the old geometry? Those were the practical questions he'd built his life around. The small consequences that spreadsheets didn't capture. He kept pushing the same two kinds of answers. First, test it, really test it, under weather, under holiday surges, under the small everyday breakdowns that find a system's soft spots. Second, if you move people, move them gently. Phased options, retraining, bridge funding. He asked for timelines that included failure modes, not just attractive success paths. He argued in meetings with a low, insistent voice, the kind that made men reread their own proposals in the quiet that followed. Sometimes they nodded. Sometimes they altered numbers. Sometimes they filed his points away like a bureaucrat files a note, acknowledged, unseen. Then the first true test arrived, not from a plan but from the city itself. A new municipal regulation came through, an innocuous-seeming rule about loading zones and delivery hours meant to ease daytime traffic in a newly gentrified district. On paper, it read like civility. Fewer commercial deliveries at noon in exchange for permitted night access. For large, well-capitalized hubs, the change was tolerable. For the small operators whose incomes were margin by margin and who relied on certain daytime windows to return stock to shops, it was a seismic shift. A small bakery that had used the same narrow loading window for decades called Thomas in a voice that trembled despite the baker's years of hard practice. The new hours meant the driver could not return before the stall closed, which in turn meant payroll would be late. The baker, who had learned to count on the payroll cycle to feed a family, was afraid of what one missed day would do. It was a small, practical fear that moved like heat through Thomas's chest. He could see the cascade. An enforced change, an unavoidable delay, a resigned worker, unpaid bills, a moment that multiplied in the quiet of someone's kitchen. He put the municipal memo in his pocket and went to work. He called the city office, not as a threat but as a concerned orderly. He showed them the human map of what their regulation would do in the neighborhoods that didn't have back-ends and lobbyists. He asked for a grace period for micro-operators, a temporary carve-out while better loading alternatives were arranged. The bureaucrats, used to being lectured by lobbyists or demeaned by angry stores, listened differently to practical consequence. Thomas's voice had that effect. Steady, granular, impossible to caricature as merely self-interested. The city agreed to a review. It was not a triumph. It was a delay. It bought time, which for Thomas often operated like a kind of currency. Time meant he could reroute a pallet, find a sympathetic council aide who knew how transit worked, and quietly introduce the idea of night permits monitored by partnership with local shops. It was small governance, problem-solving that kept mornings intact. While he wove administrative channels, he also kept an eye on the market. The hub proponents continued their work. They secured a pilot agreement with a promising tech firm that promised to optimize routes and shrink labor costs. Thomas did not oppose technological progress outright. He opposed its thoughtless application. He insisted that any pilot include caps on displacement and require shared oversight by representatives of the small operators. He wanted human voices in the experiment, people who would see when a route's math failed because of a winter storm or a school pickup hour. He lost some votes. He won enough to keep the pilot from becoming a steamroller. Then came an incident so ordinary it seemed almost cruel. A delivery truck slid on an unexpected patch of black ice and hit a curb hard enough to shear a pallet. No one was hurt. The truck driver, shaken but alive, climbed down and cursed the winter air. The immediate damage was inventory loss and a late delivery to a florist whose weekend sales mattered for a family she supported. The pilot's algorithms had suggested a route that shaved minutes but had not taken the weather-induced hazard into account. The hub proponents were ready to call the mishap an anomaly. Thomas saw it as a demonstration of the cost of ignoring human judgment. He arranged a quick meeting with the firm's local representative over coffee that smelled faintly of burnt sugar and municipal warmth. He didn't scold. He spoke plainly. The route optimization was elegant until the road betrayed it. You needed people who knew the city in the bones, not just in digital maps. You needed to measure not only minutes saved but resilience under stress. The representative, young and earnest, listened. She was sincere, perhaps more than anyone else in the room had ever been, about mixing code with the city's temper. They agreed to add human override checks, dispatchers empowered to reject an optimized route when local knowledge suggested caution. The florist received a partial delivery that night. The missing stems were replaced by a small cash settlement from a reserve the pilot had agreed to maintain for early trials. The driver was home in time to sleep. The florist's weekend did not collapse. It was not an earth-shifting victory. It was a small repair executed with speed and decency. Thomas noted it as a success he could live with. The technology advanced and the people it. Operators. He wanted human voices in the experiment, people who would see when a route's math failed because of a winter storm or a school pickup hour. He lost some votes. He won enough to keep the pilot from becoming a steamroller. Then came an incident so ordinary it seemed almost cruel. A delivery truck slid on an unexpected patch of black ice and hit a curb hard enough to shear a pallet. No one was hurt. The truck driver, shaken but alive, climbed down and cursed the winter air. The immediate damage was inventory loss and a late delivery to a florist whose weekend sales mattered for a family she supported. The pilot's algorithms had suggested a route that shaved minutes but had not taken the weather-induced hazard into account. The hub proponents were ready to call the mishap an anomaly. Thomas saw it as a demonstration of the cost of ignoring human judgment. He arranged a quick meeting with the firm's local representative over coffee that smelled faintly of burnt sugar and municipal warmth. He didn't scold. He spoke plainly. The route optimization was elegant until the road betrayed it. You needed people who knew the city in the bones, not just in digital maps. You needed to measure not only minutes saved but resilience under stress. The representative, young and earnest, listened. She was sincere, perhaps more than anyone else in the room had ever been, about mixing code with the city's temper. They agreed to add human override checks, dispatchers empowered to reject an optimized route when local knowledge suggested caution. The florist received a partial delivery that night. The missing stems were replaced by a small cash settlement from a reserve the pilot had agreed to maintain for early trials. The driver was home in time to sleep. The florist's weekend did not collapse. It was not an earth-shifting victory. It was a small repair executed with speed and decency. Thomas noted it as a success he could live with. The technology advanced and the people it could harm were first invited to the table to limit damage. But even small victories have a way of raising expectations. The pilot's early correction was touted by some as proof that modernization could work if guided by goodwill. Others read it as evidence that Thomas's caution was obsolete. Technology would learn faster than tradition. The debates turned into subtexts at every meeting. Amid the policy wrangling and logistics, there were personal moments that kept Thomas tethered to what mattered. A young dispatcher he had mentored called one evening to say her mother had been offered a small manufacturing shift in a distant part of the city and feared the commute. Thomas found a partial solution. Adjust a route, combine 2 runs, ask a driver to include an extra stop at a better hour. The dispatcher wept quietly on the phone, a private, grateful sound that Thomas folded into his day like a small light. These acts, patches, negotiations, modest institutional changes, were the marrow of his life. They weren't dramatic. They were patient, cumulative, often invisible to those who preferred the blaze of headlines. Yet they kept entire livelihoods moving like invisible gears. Still, the pressure shifted in another direction. The hub proponents began to form alliances with outside investors, men with capital who wanted scale and were willing to finance transitions in return for control. Money changes incentives. Where once disagreements were framed as choices about community, they now touched on board seats and returns. Thomas felt the ground tilt. The arguments became less about how to preserve mornings and more about how to accelerate return on investment. He saw the danger, haste for profit framed as inevitability. He convened small conversations with older men who still had some standing. He insisted on terms. Any capital would include community clauses, conditional buyouts, training budgets, and enforceable timelines for small operators to adapt. Some men signed on, influenced by the clarity of the proposal. Others grumbled that contracts could be gamed. Thomas welcomed the skepticism. It kept the safeguards alive. Winter eased into spring. The pilot ran, adjusted, and continued. The city slowly opened a formal review of delivery regulations with representatives from all sides. The work continued. 100 small negotiations, a dozen modest saves, half a dozen compromises that hurt someone in the short term but kept a majority intact. At night, when the city grew still and the streetlights cast long clarifying pools across the pavement, Thomas would walk and think of the many mornings he had kept steady without anyone attributing the work to him. He knew, with the kind of certainty that comes with long practice, that keeping systems humane required patient attention to small harms, a willingness to build repair mechanisms, and the appetite to trade short glamour for durable outcomes. But he also knew that the gathering alliances of capital and the hub proponents' growing impatience made the next phase inevitable. The fun of pilots and minor corrections would give way to bargaining where promises hardened into contracts and the stakes rose from bread and butter to ownership. That bargaining would require a different kind of skill. Not only the quiet engineering of continuity, but the hard, visible work of negotiation at a higher table. He did not relish that table. He had spent his life avoiding spectacle. Yet he had learned that stewardship sometimes demanded stepping into rooms where decisions are sawed into their real shapes. The time to remain behind the curtain was shrinking. He felt it like a tide pulling at his boots. Thomas folded the night's papers and made notes for the morning. Who to call, whom to ask for a guarantee, which counsel aid needed a reminder. The work was practical, minute, unpoetic. It was also, he knew, the place where a life could be meaningful in the way that mattered most, by keeping the little things that make mornings possible from collapsing when the world tilted toward speed. He lit a cigarette, an old, poor comfort, and watched the smoke go thin into the air. The city slept on. The next morning would bring more calls, more meetings, more little rescues. In the quiet, with the ash falling into the tray, Thomas felt the shape of the coming months. A slow, precise battle waged not with guns or grand pronouncements, but with contracts, contingency clauses, and the stubborn conviction that dignity should be priced into any plan for change. He put the cigarette out and turned off the lamp. The house was still, and he fell asleep thinking of hinges and doorways, of which ones needed oiling and which were safe to open. He knew enough to understand that the real tests of character weren't the speeches or the plans. They were the nights you stayed awake fixing the things everyone assumed would always be fixed. Tomorrow would ask him to keep doing precisely that. The morning the contracts were supposed to be signed, the city felt like a held breath ready to let loose. March sunlight came through the high windows of the conference room, cutting a straight line across the polished table and illuminating the neat piles of paper that would decide a great many ordinary mornings. Investors in dark coats sat one side. Hub proponents with glossy slides sat the other. Between them, Thomas sat with a small leather binder, a folder of contingencies, a list of names, a stack of modest guarantees he had insisted on until men tired of arguing and a municipal clerk finally typed them into a draft everyone could read. People had imagined this meeting would be loud, the kind of day that appears in papers and becomes a story people tell at parties. It did not go that way. The meeting moved with the kind of low, efficient momentum Thomas respected. Careful questions, the occasional sharp point made for precision, not showmanship, and signatures that required a readiness to be specific about consequences rather than vague about promises. It was, in a way, exactly what he had always hoped any change would be: rigorous, accountable, and with a place for the smallest actors who had previously been invisible. He watched the investors when they proposed fancy clauses that would accelerate payouts if targets were hit. He asked calmly, "And if the target is missed because a winter storm shut half the city down, who makes payroll that month?" The question was not a trap. It was a necessary piece of arithmetic. The air moved differently when they realized their models had holes where real lives lived. The investors adjusted language, because it was easier to accept a concession that preserved reputation than to defend a cold spreadsheet that could destroy someone's rent cycle. At one table, a young hub architect, fierce, bright, the kind of man who had once argued for immediate consolidation, leaned forward and asked the practical question Thomas most wanted them to ask. Who will be responsible for retraining, and how will we measure true displacement rather than short-term attrition? It was the pivot. From that moment, the conversation turned from ideology to durable mechanics. Retraining funds, phased deadlines, commitments to local hiring, a city-managed relief fund for anyone displaced without immediate placement, and an independent oversight committee that included representatives of the smallest operators. It was not perfect. No honest settlement ever is. There were lines blurred, compromises made, and promises given that would require tending. But where the meeting could have birthed a take-it-or-leave-it contract they had to accept because scale looked inevitable, it produced instead an architecture that required proof of humane outcomes before ownership would change hands. Capital could not simply sweep through and erase the scaffolding of ordinary lives. It would have to meet measurable protections first. Those protections were not charity, they were clauses, deadlines, audits, payroll guarantees, retraining budgets, and pilot thresholds. Signing day ended with a modest, awkward applause. No one made a spectacle. There were short, honest handshakes. The investors had their contracts. The hub proponents had a timetable. The city had one oversight, and the small operators had clauses that made them visible in the legal language the world respected. Thomas folded his binder and felt, for a long instant, as if he had steadied a table before a storm hit it too hard. Afterward, there were small actions that mattered more to him than the signatures. He visited the baker whose morning he had saved in winter. The baker handed him a loaf, still warm and smelling like common grace, and refused payment for it. The mechanic who'd fixed the driver's truck came by with a chained set of tools and a look that said nothing more than, "I'm still here." The dispatcher whose mother had found the shift that would feed her family hugged Thomas so fast and tight that his jacket wrinkled. And for a moment the quiet man who preferred a steady gait felt the warm chaos of being appreciated. He also knew the work had only been postponed, not completed. Pilots would continue. The oversight committee had to prove itself. Sometimes the legal guardrails do little against pressure when money wants to move faster than promises. Thomas accepted that. His job had never been to declare victory. It had been to make sure victory did not mean loss for the most vulnerable in its wake. The contracts were a field test, not a final peace treaty. A few weeks later, the pilot's initial phase completed with mixed but hopeful results. The hubs operated under the new constraints and were required to demonstrate no net displacement beyond a small, manageable number, and those who could not find placement received city-funded bridge support and retraining. It was messy. There were errors. There were nights when Thomas sat awake because a breakdown had forced a postponement that rippled down to someone waiting for pay. But it was reparable. Repairability is often the hallmark of humane systems, he liked to tell those who asked. Where things could be corrected without ruin, they tended to be worth the risk. The younger men who'd once pushed for speed began, slowly, to see the advantage of durability. Some of them learned to value the political cover the protections gave them. No one wants to lose capital or reputation over a preventable backlash. Others remained impatient, but the system now required them to act within guardrails rather than outside them. The pilots taught everyone something practical. That speed without buffers was fragile. Scale with care could survive storms. Thomas did not take public credit for the clauses that had protected the baker or the retraining programs that kept a dozen families afloat that spring. He did not want the headlines. He wanted the work to carry on without him. So he began, almost imperceptibly, to shift his role from frontline solver to quiet architect. He mentored 3 apprentices more intensely than before, giving them the binders, the checklists, the small institutional memory he had accumulated. He taught them the questions that reoriented talk into consequence. Who pays if this fails? Who eats if this delays? Who loses shelter if this collapses? He watched them ask those questions, not because he wanted their gratitude, but because he wanted the culture to persist. The apprentices, stubborn, curious, alternately impatient and thoughtful, gave him a reason to step back. He made sure one of them oversaw the Oversight Committee's first audit and that another had the authority to authorize frontline relief funds in emergencies. These were small abdications of power that preserved the system by distributing responsibility and knowledge. He had learned that stewardship was not about clinging to authority. It was about enabling others to make careful choices. There were personal costs. The years he had poured into steadying mornings meant he had missed small, private occasions. Birthdays he rescheduled, dinners postponed. He repaired some of those hems when he could. One spring afternoon he took a day off, which he called a proper Sunday, and walked with his partner along a riverside path, listening to the city move around them with all its ordinary noise. They bought an absurdly expensive pie and ate it without thinking about anything but who took the last bite. It was both decadent and necessary, a small counterweight to years of obligation. In time, the pilot matured into an approved plan with measured timelines and enforceable community protections. The city's oversight mechanism remained in place for 3 full years as part of a staggered ownership transition. The hub proponents gained scale, investors earned returns, and many of the small operators found new niches or retraining paths that kept them afloat. A few people were displaced despite all the safeguards. That fact never left Thomas. He visited the families affected, arranged bridge support, and ensured retraining budgets were actually accessible. He paid attention to those losses with the same care he'd used to prevent them. Prevention and repair were sisters in his work. The culmination of this long, quiet campaign was not a parade or a speech. It was a small meeting of the Oversight Committee on a late Thursday when the quarterly report showed that displacement rates were within the promised bounds and retraining placement had a modest but real success rate. The committee members, representatives from city agencies, small operators, investors, and the hired auditors, sat around a table and, after a long, exacting conversation, nodded. The city, cautious and satisfied, allowed the next phase of the program to continue. Men who had once shouted about inevitability now spoke more carefully. The world did not suddenly become perfect. It had not even become noticeably better for everyone. But it had learned, at least for the moment, to value repair and human cost. That evening, Thomas walked the streets in the light that felt like a long exhale. The baker's window glowed. A child's bicycle lay on its side on a stoop where an older man mended it. A taxi idled and the driver waved to a friend walking by. Ordinary things moved the way he liked. Quietly, stubbornly, with the small guarantees that let families plan lunches and school trips. He felt, not triumphant, but like someone who had made sure a few more mornings would start without fright. He did not see himself in the mirror as a steward or a hero. He saw a man who had been given proximity to decisions and had chosen to press for the durability of others rather than his own fame. That choice had cost him time and convenience, but it had given him something else. A life threaded with small acts of repair that, in the aggregate, made mornings possible for many. At home that night, he gathered the apprentices in Sal for a simple meal. Bread, cheese, the pie that had been too extravagant, telling them nothing grand. He listened as they talked about their plans, about adjustments they intended to make. He answered questions where necessary and offered the quiet correction that guided decisions back into consequence. When the apprentices left, the house felt full of a different kind of light. The one generated by people who would carry forward a practice he'd wanted to become culture rather than personality. Before he went to bed, he wrote a short note and slipped it into the binder he had always kept close. It read, simply, "Ask the right questions. Make repair the default. Leave the room steadier than you found it." He did not expect the binder to become scripture. He expected it to be useful. In the months that followed, he scaled back some of his daily presence. He attended the big meetings with a steady hand and let the apprentices run more of the love. The bakery that opened at dawn, the driver with the careful smile, the mechanic who always kept an extra wrench, remained. Those were the things he wanted his life to have protected. And so the story ended not with a dramatic unmasking or a final confrontation, but with a continuing, steady hum. The sound of a city where someone had insisted that change include repair. The accomplishments were modest and human. Contracts that enforced dignity, apprentices who asked the right questions, small operators who did not vanish overnight. On one late evening, perhaps a year after the first contract was signed, Thomas stood at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood light up for bed. He felt no grand sense of completion, only the soft satisfaction that things seemed less brittle than before. The binder sat on his table, its pages worn from use. The note he had written to himself still lay within. Ask the right questions. Make repair the default. Leave the room steadier than you found it. He folded his hands and breathed. The city breathed with him. In the small, practical quiet of ordinary lives, of loaves delivered on time, of drivers who could sleep, of apprentices learning to ask blunt questions. There was the answer he wanted. The work would continue. It would need tending. Others would make mistakes. But the culture he had helped shape had, at least for now, learned to value repair as much as speed. That was the kind of peace worth living for. Thomas turned away from the window and sat at the small table to eat a slice of the pie he had promised his partner he would share. He did not think of headlines or monuments. He thought of mornings, the simple, repeating miracle of people waking and starting again. He had spent his life making them possible. When the pie was gone and the dishes washed, he walked to bed with the ordinary satisfaction of a man who had kept his promise. That when the city opened its eyes the next morning, it would find its small assurances intact and its people able to try again.